All right, good morning. We are ready for Revelation Part 4, Lesson 7. And we are on the subject of the Day of the Lord. And I did look ahead, and we will be doing a second week on this Day of the Lord. And I think you're going to understand why the necessity for this is there as we move through it. Right now, this week, what we're going to do is try to lay down some basic points of reference, some anchors. So what we are going to do is a little bit of a timeline. It's not going to be an extensive timeline, so it won't be all filled in like crazy like it usually is, but it will have enough in it that concerning the subject of the Day of the Lord, we'll begin to see where the references to those fall on that timeline, and you'll begin to start seeing it a little bit better. But the other thing I want to do as a preliminary to this, as a walk-in sort of, is read to you just a couple of verses that we covered this week, just to kind of warm your brains up a little bit. Let me get it's right here. I've got two different boxes here. Okay, the first one I want to read to you is Joel 2, 10 and 11. So let me find that one. Joel. I put all my observation worksheets into one folder, and I gave myself tabs. So this might be a helpful tool for the rest of you. That way, every observation worksheet that we have done that has anything to do with our Revelation study are all together, and they're marked specifically with the understanding of end times study. So it's kind of like my own end times Bible. It's obviously not a full Bible, but it has a lot of things in here. Okay, the first verse I'm going to read to you is Joel 2, 10 and 11. And he's one of the things you have to understand about these drop-in verses, places like Joel, there was one, I think, in Ezekiel, and I can't remember where the other one was, but these are words of God. They're oracles from God to Israel. They have an immediate fulfillment in some of the things that are going on for that nation at that time, but then they also have and the things that they're doing at that time, these are the foreshadows, right? Like Antiochus Epiphanes, a foreshadow to Antichrist. Some of these things that were going on concerning Babylon and Medo-Persia and all these conquerings that was going on, how God was judging Israel. These are foreshadows to say, like this, but more thoroughly, I am going to, in that day, do more. And so here's a little piece of what's going on in verse 10 and 11. He says, before them, the earth quakes and the heavens tremble. The sun and the moon grow dark and the stars lose their brightness. The Lord utters his voice before his army. Surely his camp is very great. For strong is he who carries out God's word. The day of the Lord is indeed great and very awesome, and who can endure it? Now, does that hearken any verse to us in Revelation? Which one does it make you think of? Who can stand in chapter 6, verse 17, right? At the end of that, he's like, and who can stand? And the earthquakes were happening all over his head. Another one is in Ezekiel 32. Let me see, I hope I have that one in here, because I don't remember if that one was a part of my 32. Yeah, can you look it up for me? I'd like you to read verses 7 and 8. This is a oracle towards Egypt, I believe. Okay, so read what it says there.
Ezekiel 32:7, and when I extinguish you, I will cover the heavens and darken their stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light.
Go on to 8.
And all the shining lights in heaven I will darken over you, and I will set darkness on your land, declares the Lord God.
Okay, so did you hear any kind of a repeated theme in those two verses? What was it that's the concept of darkness, things happening in the cosmos, so to speak, in the heavens, and so those things are kind of a repeated thing that I'm sure you also picked up on in your homework, because over and over those, you kept having to write those down on your list, right? Okay, and then what I want to do now is take you back to Matthew, when we did our study on Matthew, now we did this in part 3. So this is familiar territory to you, but one of the things you have to remember about Matthew 24, which is our place of that we have that infamous statement, the abomination of desolation and Israel must flee, right? Is that Matthew 23 is just before that, right? It follows before 24. And here Jesus is denouncing the scribes, the Pharisees. He's talking to them about how they kill the prophets and so forth. And as he is about to then leave there and go, the next day is what Matthew 24 is about. He's in the temple again, preaching and teaching, and then he begins to ascend to the mountain, the Mount of Olives. And then the disciples ask him that big question, tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? I kind of wish that Kay had started us back here before we did our homework this week, because Matthew 24 is the outline. Remember how we did paragraph outlines in Matthew 24, and how that shows us a chronology of the events that are going to happen, how we were able to lay out on a timeline the things that are going to occur. Matthew 23, though, this is an interesting statement. If you back up, it says in verse 37, Jesus is rebuking these Pharisees and Sadducees for their rejection of him, right? This is at the time of Jesus's first coming. We, for this day at the end of the age, are looking for his second coming. And when we speak of his coming, this is what we need to iron out. What kind of a coming are we speaking of when we speak of the coming of the Lord for the day of the Lord, right? Because there are other places where the coming of the Lord doesn't have anything to do with the day of the Lord, right? Okay. So here he says to them in verse 37 to 39, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. Now, this is interesting. He's speaking about himself leaving. He is leaving them. Right now, he's in their presence and they've rejected him. He is the one who is their Messiah that they have been longing for, so to speak. Do you remember in one of the verses that we read this week was, you longing for the day of the Lord? Why? Why would you long for the day of the Lord? You who are rebellious, you who are in disobedience, you who won't listen to me, right? You are obviously unaware of what the day of the Lord is about, because if you understood it, you would repent immediately. So he says after this, your house is being left you desolate. He says, for I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now that is a really good starting place to begin a subject study on the day of the Lord and what is it exactly speaking of. Matthew 24, then, if you flip over there, if you have your observation worksheets on that handy, I don't know if any of you do or not, but it wouldn't be bad idea for you to kind of pull that out and lay that out where you can kind of view it as we're having our discussion today, because this outline of Matthew 24 is the timeline for us. It's the fixed timeline, because Jesus himself said, this is how it's going to happen. They wanted to know what would be the signs of his coming, right? And so he lays it out. And so in verses 4 to 8 of Matthew 24, he responds to them saying, these are the signs, basically. And the first thing he presents to them is the subject of what? What does he call that beginning? The birth pangs. So 4 to 8 is the birth pangs. Good job, Carol, from the back row. Because he said, these are things that are going to be happening. Many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars, rumors of wars. See to it that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. So you know you're not at the end yet in these verses. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pains. Then in the opening of verse 9, then. So now you know you've made a new passage of time. He moves to the next step. He says, but then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Now, so this is very interesting because he's actually showing you that some of these events then that begin in verse 9 through 14, and then verse 15 being that pivotal point where you see the abomination of desolation, correct? And where do we know that abomination of desolation falls on this timeline? Let's write it in. At the beginning of which 3.5? The second, right. So right in here is the abomination of desolation. And it's what was spoken of by Daniel. And we know that's in 9, is it 24 to 27, I think. So I'll just put that on there. Daniel 9:24 to, I guess I should put that in front of it, huh? I did that oddly, but that helps you there. So this is the abomination of desolation that occurs in the 7th trumpet. And that is the marker point in Matthew 24 that you hit in verse 15. So what does that tell you then about from verse 9 to 14? After that word then, because now you know you're into a new segment, right? What part or where on your timeline then does the verses 9 to 14 go? The first 3.5. So then you have Matthew 24, 9 to, what did I say? 14, 9 to 14 is the first 3.5 years. Okay, so it covers this whole section right here, right? And before that, then the part that was called birth pangs then comes back here, right? And that's in Matthew 24, and let's see, verse 4 to 8. Okay, so this is just a review of this Matthew 24 to show you this outline. So you have birth pangs here. You've got the first 3.5 years. Then this is the last 3.5 years. That starts in verse 15. The pivotal point, the point that gives us our marker, so we knew how to put it on this timeline, is the verse 15. And therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee. So now he says right here, those in Judea must flee. And that's Matthew 24, what verse? Okay, all righty, so there we go. So that gives us that much information. I'm not going to read all the rest, but I want to drop down just to some certain verses. 21 verse, and in 21, Matthew 24, verse 21, it also says there, for then there will be great tribulation. So now we have another title here. We're going to call this Great Tribulation. So since this is Great Tribulation, and what preceded it? Tribulation. But just on a lesser degree. Now, how do we know that that goes there? Well, what if it was Daniel who spoke of it? What did Daniel tell us that helps us know that this goes in the middle of this 7-year period? What did he say was going to happen? There was going to be a person show up on the scene, and what was he going to do? Yes, we see that in Thessalonica. Yeah, but what did Daniel tell? What was the prophecy that Daniel gave us? What is it that he said? Who is the one he says is going to come, and he's going to do what? What's he going to do with Israel? Make a covenant. And then what does he do with that covenant? He breaks it in the middle of the week. He breaks the covenant. That's how we know this abomination of desolation falls in the middle of this 7-year period, because of Daniel 9:24-27. It says that the prince who is to come he breaks the covenant in the middle of that week. Okay, so now we are ready to look at the very tail end of that. So during that period called the Great Tribulation is what we're reading at here. And he says, behold, I've told you in advance, starting in verse 25. And in 26, he says, so if they say to you, behold, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe them. Isn't that interesting? There's still going to be false Christs, even in that last period of time, proclaiming that they're the Christ. And he's saying, don't believe them. He said, for just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. So what has he just told you? During the time of this great tribulation, what has Jesus not yet done? He's not yet come. So his coming is sometime before, obviously before the 1,000-year reign, but not during the majority of this great tribulation. It must be then where? At the end. And we know that because we have read Matthew or Revelation 19, right? So let's put Revelation 19 up here in verse 11. And it's there we see Jesus comes. What does he come for? For war and judgment. That's right. So he's coming for war. He's coming for judgment. Revelation 19:11. It's in the 7th bowl, the very tail end of that, because that's when everything comes to its culmination. All these judgments have been poured out. All the bowls have been poured out. God has finished all the work that he said he was going to do concerning these seals and trumpets and bowls. All that has happened. Now Jesus comes, and that's the grand finale of it all. That's the Armageddon, the war of Armageddon that everybody knows about. It's the time when men's flesh is eaten by the birds of the air, which is pretty gross. But it's also the time when God is going to do what with Satan? He binds him and he throws, but not Satan, not in the 7th. Well, he does it just before the beginning of the 1,000 years, but he deals with this man called who? Antichrist, or the prince who is to come. So here then he said, he puts Antichrist is thrown into the lake of fire. Yes, and the false prophet. Good job. Lake of fire. Okay, so now we're ready. Now we're ready to talk about all this that we did in our homework, because now what you have is you've got a little bit of a timeline. You see where your pieces are, your major pieces are that you already have determined. These are things that we have studied and studied and studied. We don't need to have a lot of explanation about them. See how easy that was? That was like simple. Do you remember when we did this the first time, how you were like, what? How come? What? How'd you do that? Where is that? Right now it's like, got it. But Matthew 23 and all of Matthew 24 is our context for this. That is where you have to go first in order to even really begin to understand, as you're looking at these verses, where might they go on a timeline, right? A couple of other things that might be helpful to you. Do you remember when we did this chart? What was this? This is in lesson 7, part 2. And what we had to do was we had to do all of them. We did the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, and we put them in columns, and we said, what happens in each of these things, right? And then we looked for repeated patterns. What did we begin to see were repeated patterns in here? Well, you can look at my little clip art on here, and my clip art kind of shows you that there are repeated patterns, right? Okay, and one of the repeated patterns has to do with the heavenly celestial beings. Also, you see a repeated pattern of earthquakes, right? And are these things that you saw popping up in your homework this week? Yeah, so if you had this handy dandy little tool to lay out on your desk while you were studying this week, this would have been helpful too, because as you were reading about in that day, this is going to happen, that's going to happen, you could almost put it right here on your timeline just by looking at your repeated pictures. That's why I like pictures. That's why I like to color code things. It's one of the reasons the inductive method is so handy, because it helps you very quickly identify, oh, where would that go on here? Oh, there it is right there. Oh, it's on the waters. Oh, there's all the waters. Oh, there's all the earth, and there's the sea, and there's the land of Israel, right? So this is another tool that could have been helpful to you this week. So these two things would have been helpful. Doing a timeline would have been helpful. None of that was given to you in your homework. The only thing I can say to you is the longer you do inductive Bible study, the more you'll begin to realize these are kind of fundamentals you almost have to lay out for yourself. Precept does not. The curriculum, as you can see, is already lengthy enough, right? We already have so much work to do. But if you'll take the extra step to say, okay, what's the context for this? I don't care what I'm doing. My husband always laughs at me, but I do a timeline for everything, because I want to know in perspective to when Joel's speaking and when Amos is speaking and when Isaiah is speaking, where am I? What kingdom was it? What was the year? Were they in Assyrian captivity yet? Were they in Babylonian captivity yet? Who are they speaking to, right? And especially when you've got these nuances in the scripture where the prophets are speaking to the immediate moment, but are also speaking long-term prophecy. So they're saying, this is what I'm going to do to you, Babylon. This is what I'm going to do to you, Edom, right? And part of it, there's a partial fulfillment that occurred in that day for them, because God showed Israel in the immediate moment what he's talking about he's going to be doing, but he doesn't do it to the totality of what the text tells you, like utter desolation, right? So what he's showing them is, I'm going to show you I can, and I'll start by giving you a demonstration. It's kind of like when you give a kids a warning, all right, you got, that's 1, that's 2, that's 3, you're out, right? That's kind of what God does with us. And in the Word of God, he does that by first showing a demonstration of how he says, I'm going to judge. Then he goes ahead and judges that immediate situation that's going on with Israel, whatever it is. Then he goes deeper and begins to tell you more about what he's going to do at the finality of it all, when it comes to its total fruition. He also often gives you also a shadowing of understanding that there's a spiritual power that's behind all this, and who that spiritual power is. So last week, I think it was Isaiah we got into, right? We saw that Satan, the son of the morning star or something like that, right? That was mentioned in that one passage. And what we did, we saw he wanted to ascend to heaven, and he wanted to be like God, basically. And this is all a picture of what's going on behind the life that we're living. We have a life going on planet Earth, but in the heavenly realms, there's spiritual powers that are at work also. Daniel showed us that, right? Okay, so that kind of sets us up. We're ready to go. We were asked basically to go through every one of these references and make these lists. Now, I don't know about you guys, but that was a daunting task. I did it, and I did it more than once, because the first time I did, I didn't like the titles that she had at the top of her columns, because I felt like they were redundant. Yeah, thank you. I'm not alone. Okay. I really felt like for instance, the signs of, or the beginnings of the time frame were the same as describing it. You know, they were the same. So you're just moving it from here to here, and sometimes you eliminate one or two verses, but other than that, they ended up being the same. So here's what I did. I broke it down. This is how we're going to handle it today. We're going to do titles and the description. That's all we're not going to try to break it down into all these things, because I think it makes a more concise list and we see it. I think that one of the things she wanted you to see about the idea of the signs of the beginning or the end was she wanted you to see if there were any time references in there that could give you time factors. It would have been better to just have had a place maybe in the title section, say title it and timeline it, or give your time anything that has a time reference to it. Note that, because there wouldn't be that many of those. There'd be a few, and then answer the other questions. So I streamlined it, and that's what we're going to do. So we're going to start by titles. We're going to put over here in one single column, because we don't have very many titles, and they become redundant, right? They're repetitive over and over. Then we're just going to look at these descriptions. So let's start in 2 Thessalonians. This one is a very interesting scripture to look at, because get my worksheet here. Because did you notice that there is a conflating of a couple of different days that are going on in here? And you really only get the full picture of it when you add 1 Thessalonians to 2 Thessalonians. It would have been better to have started with 1 Thessalonians and then done 2 Thessalonians, because 1 Thessalonians clarifies what these two different days are. Did you all come to see that there was a difference in these two different days?
It looked to me like Thessalonians 4:13 through 17, rapture.
Yep.
And then the day of the Lord doesn't start until 5 verse 1.
Yeah. And in chapter 5, what do you see is your major contrast? What is the contrast that's going on? He's saying, let me just read a few things. For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. While they are saying, peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them like labor pains on a woman with a child, and they will not escape. But you, brethren, right? You're not of darkness. So what does that tell you the day of the Lord is there? Darkness, right? That day will not overtake you, for you are all what? Sons of the light and sons of the day. So it sounds to me like there's another day that's for us. We're sons of that day that's of light, not sons of a day that is of darkness, right? But since we are of the day in verse 8, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet, the hope of salvation. For, now here's another contrast. Verse 9, 10, and 11 are really, really good. God has not destined us for what? Wrath. Now, what do we know the great tribulation is also referred to as? God's wrath. We know that from, does anybody remember where? Okay, think of your segment divisions. You're so funny. Do you remember your segment? Okay, we did segment divisions on a special chart. And so we had some were parentheses. And one of the parentheses was called the signs, right? Verse 50 or chapter 15, which is the very tail end of those signs, it closes by taking you to the point of the bowls, right? Where we left off. And what does it say in 15? Somebody open 15 and read those first couple of verses of Revelation. Okay, there you go. 7 bowls are God's wrath, right? So that's what that basically tells us. So now we know where the wrath of God goes. I'm going to kind of do a lightning bolt over here on this so that you catch this particular thing. Okay, that's God's wrath right there. So we know God's wrath occurs all during this time frame right here, right? Are you following that? Because that's nope. Well, there is what we did is we nuanced it. We said certainly all of the tribulation is tribulation. It's horrible, and in a way it is God's wrath. It's that day that he is going to deal with man. But the way the scriptures break it down, they identify the wrath part as really just being the 7 bowls. And it says, right, that's your verse for you to know that. Verse 15 in chapter 15, Revelation 15, verse 1 and 2. It might go down to 3 or 4 even.
In 12:12 it says, "Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you." And
Right.
that's at 3.5 years.
Okay, so we can put that on there too if you'd like.
Great wrath. That's the devil's.
Yeah, he has great wrath and God has wrath. So yes, that's true. So we know right here is when Satan comes down. And that was in 12 what?
That's in 12:12.
Okay, thank you. 12:12. Revelation. Make sure I get the right reference on there. So now we have added one more little piece to our thing. Can you all see that at all? We'll take a picture and post it. Okay. So at least you now know then Satan comes down here. He does have wrath. That's a good point to bring out. But there's a difference between his wrath and God's wrath. The bowls are the wrath of God, and he is pouring those out upon the earth. So the great tribulation is identified by the fact that this is the wrath of God being poured out. Okay. All right. Now, where was I in my thinking?
The scripture that says that Jews are not destined for
Wrath. Yes.
doesn't have to do with the first 3.5 years.
Not necessarily. And that's where, okay, good point. So,
First, on 2 Thessalonians 2:1, it says the coming of Jesus and our gathering together.
okay, that's where I'm heading. Yep. That's exactly where I'm heading. Yes, and in 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 1 and 2 opens up to carry on. This is why you really needed to start with 1 Thessalonians first, because what you're seeing then is in 1 Thessalonians is basically speaking of a day when we will do what? What is the brethren, what are the Christians going to have happen for us in this day that's being spoken of in 1 Thessalonians 4? The rapture. That day when the Lord comes, see in verse 15, it's the coming of the Lord. They call it that. But is that the coming of the Lord for the day of wrath? Because if you make a list here, what does it say? The coming of the Lord is going to happen for us. What does it say in verse 17? We're going to be caught up in the air, and we're going to do what? Yeah, we're going to meet the Lord in the air, and we will be with the Lord always, right? In 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 to 18. Yeah, these are our observation worksheets I'm sorry. I really recommend, because we're going to be doing this from now to the end. If you could put yours in a notebook like this so that you can follow with me and bounce back and forth, because if you have your observation worksheets handy, you're going to see all your marked notes. And all your lovely pictures. Like I've got pictures of the rapture going on here, and it helps me. Because then I immediately recognize what I'm looking at. And if I don't know it, I write it on the sheet of paper itself. Resurrection of those who died in Christ. That's what the whole chapter is about. So 1 Thessalonians tells you there's a day coming when the brethren are going to be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. That's in verse chapter 4. Then it follows in 5 with a contrast going on between a day of the Lord, which is destruction, verse 3. They're going to be saying peace and safety, but what's going to be going on? Destruction for them. It will come upon them suddenly like labor pains upon a woman with a child, and they will not escape. That sounds very daunting to me. That does not sound like just a minor scuffle. This is something really serious. And then he says in verse 9, for God has not destined us for wrath, but for what? Obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. So what are we being rescued from in the context of this statement? Is this salvation as in justification, or is this a different subject matter? We know we get justified, right? When we get saved. But is that what this is saying, that we are going to get salvation from? What are we being saved from? Wrath. We are being saved from wrath. So what are we being saved from ever having to go through? That day of wrath, right? At least for sure the last 3.5, could be longer, but this is where the conflict comes in the community of the Christian faith is it pre-trib, mid-trib, or post-trib? Well, I think this makes it very clear that you have to rule out post-trib. It has to be at least by mid-trib, right? I'm still hanging on to pre-trib, but I could be wrong. And if I am, God will sustain me until it's the day for him to take me up, right? But for sure, I'm not destined for wrath. It says it right here. God has not destined us for wrath, for obtaining salvation. The salvation that's being spoken of here in the context of 1 Thessalonians 5 is the day of the Lord. The whole subject of the day of the Lord is about the wrath. It says the day of the Lord comes like a thief in the night. Destruction will come upon them. They will not escape. It is for those who are destined for wrath, according to verse 9. They are destined for this wrath. And it says, and it will come upon them suddenly in those days. But for us, the coming of the Lord for us is a different coming, a totally different day. It's going to be for salvation. We are going to meet the Lord in the air. We shall be with the Lord forever, in verse 17. Those who are asleep, meaning their body is physically dead and the body is in the ground, they will rise first. Then what? Then if you are a person who's here in that day when we're going to get this rapture, we will be caught up with them so that we meet together the Lord in the air. And it says, and thus we'll be with him forever.
So that will be a bodily resurrection.
Yep.
Join their souls that are already.
Yes, that's exactly right.
So they'll have to be given a new body.
Yes. So this is 1 Corinthians chapter 15 fulfilled. The whole, that which is, how does it say in 1 Corinthians 15? Flesh, mortality must put on immortality. I haven't read it in a while. It's not rolling off the tongue all of a sudden. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15 says the whole passage is on the resurrection, physical resurrection of the body. So when you go into 1 Corinthians 15, every time you see the word dead, put the word body over that word, dead body. Okay, so that you understand it's speaking about the dead body, and that you are going to have a physical resurrection. Now it says, now let's move to 2 Corinthians 2, because that's where we started. So we'll start right here, descriptions of 2 Thessalonians, I'm right. 2, and we did just a few verses there, 1 through 12. Okay, so that's our reference. There he says, I'm looking for a certain verse. Maybe it's, hold on a second. Give me 5 seconds here. Here it is. It's back in 4. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 14. Here's kind of the foundation for who it is that is going to be a part of this resurrection. It says, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose again. Now that's what 1 Corinthians 15 is going to also springboard off of, is that subject. He talks about, if you don't believe that there's a resurrection, then we're the most of all to be pitied, because our whole faith is based on the fact that we're going to get a physical bodily resurrection, just like our Lord did. It's all based on Jesus being the first fruits. He fulfilled on the day of not Pentecost, on the day of it was the resurrection day. Which one was that? Which feast is it? The third one. The first one's Passover, unleavened bread. The Feast of Weeks is the Pentecost. I'm sorry, my brain's dead this morning, but I can't remember that third feast in there. First fruits is the resurrection, and then we get Pentecost. Is that correct? I always get those mixed up. See, they use a couple of different names for these feasts and I told you this is an area I'm weak in, is these feasts, because I'm not real strong in them, and I wish I were better at it. But in any event, what happens is the conversation is, if you don't believe that Jesus died and rose again, then why are you even in Christian faith at all? Why bother with Christian faith if there's no hope? If there's not a promise for eternal life, which is what we are banking on, right? That God says, I am the one who created you. I gave you life. I blew the breath of life into your very body. And one day when your physical body dies, don't worry, you will be absent from the body, but present with the Lord until this day when I will resurrect your body and you will be given life as I have had life. So he mentions it here in 1 Thessalonians 4. He says, for this we say to you, that by the word of the Lord, we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. Why are we going to get that resurrection? If we believe that Jesus dies and rose again, even so, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Christ. So this is the foundation. So we're laying down in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, a distinction between the coming of the Lord for a physical resurrection of the body and the day of the Lord, which is called a day of wrath and destruction.
So does that mean when the armies come down in Revelation 19, we're all like,
Yes, it does. Yes, ma'am, it certainly does. Good question. I don't know if you heard her. She said, does that mean that when we come with Jesus on the white horses in Revelation 19 and the armies of heaven come with him, and that's us, then do we come in our new bodies? The answer is yes, we do. Our new physical body will have already been given to us, because there is a resurrection before the day of wrath that catches us up to be with the Lord forever. And when he comes back in Revelation 19, we come with him on horses. So if we're caught up in a resurrection day, we've got our new bodies. And well, maybe. But one of the things I know, it says, remember in the verse, just preceding that, it says, and the bride has made herself ready. How did she make herself ready? She's put her new body on, and she's been given the rewards of the living of this life by God at the Bema seat. So now we're equipped as a helpmate to come back and serve him here in the millennial reign. We have our bodies, we have our job assignments, and we're ready to go. We come with him on those horses. So we know that we for sure are not in that day of wrath at this point, right? Absolutely. Now, how far back is the resurrection? That is where the argument comes amongst different people. And I am not arrogant enough to say that I know for sure. My hope is we are pre-trib. That is my blessed hope. And I do believe that a lot of what we see in the text kind of indicates that. I'm not going to go through the apologetics on that, because as many as I could give, they would go, but, and I don't want anyone to be angry or to reject everything else that's of such good teaching that they would not listen because they get angry about one little point. I don't want that. But I do know this, we each get to make up our own decision on where we think it falls, okay? And that's why we're studying this in this manner. Okay, so now in Thessalonians, what we want to see is this. We see that there is a day that's coming, and it's called, one of the comings is called the day of the Lord. I wish I had a red marker, and I don't. I guess maybe this pink will be dark enough. Let's see. Yeah, it's pretty good. Okay, it's called the day of the Lord, right? In Thessalonians. And that's in verse 2. And then there's also another one in verse 8. Did you notice? Just in case you missed it. What is it called there? The appearance of his coming. Isn't that cool? You can mark it in the same way. The appearance of his coming. And that's in verse 8. These are both in 2 Thess 2. Okay. In there, then, let me just kind of walk you through 2 Thessalonians a little bit. We're going to be doing 1 Thessalonians after Revelation, but 2 Thessalonians is not on our agenda. I don't know why. I'm not sure why we didn't do it. We could add it in if everybody really wants it. But let me just address the flow of this conversation a little bit with you so you kind of see it. There's a problem going on. Did you notice? What's the problem? They think they missed the day of the Lord. But what day of the Lord is it that they say they don't call it the day of the Lord? They say that they think they've missed what? In verse 1. The coming of the Lord, and for what purpose? For our gathering together to him. And he says, well, don't let that distress you. Do not be disturbed by that. Why? Why were they disturbed? Somebody must be saying, and does that tell you then, if they think that they are in the day of the Lord? Apparently this letter came and it says somebody has basically told them that they are in the day of the Lord, meaning the day of the Lord, wherever this falls on our timeline here. But for sure the bad stuff, right? They have been told they're in that day. Well, why did that disturb them? Well, because they don't expect to be in that day of the Lord. And Paul goes on to say, did I not tell you these things, right? So the concern for them is, if we're in the day of the Lord, why are we still here? Because I thought we weren't supposed to. Did we miss the promised salvation from it? We were promised we weren't going to be here for this. That's the gist of this conversation. And Paul's reply in verse 5, I told you these things while I was still with you. And then he makes a list of the apostasy comes first, then the man of lawlessness is going to be revealed, and you know what restrains him now. This is an interesting question. If they are supposed to know what's restraining them, and whatever that thing is, it's obvious enough that if it were removed, as he then goes on to say, it's going to be removed, they would notice. So it has to be something that is visible to them. That is, whatever this restraining thing is, it has to be a visible, tangible, identifiable thing, which for them he's saying, is it not still there? It's still there. So no, the day of the Lord has not yet come, because this has to be removed. He said, I told you these things. The apostasy comes first. The man of lawlessness will be revealed, but he won't be revealed until that restrainer is removed. So whatever that restrainer is, they're supposed to be able to visibly see something. The implication is that something that when he is taken out of the way, it will be obvious to them, and then the day of the Lord comes. So that's kind of the gist of this conversation. But they've tangled it because they're flowing between these two phrases, the coming of the Lord and the day of the Lord, which sounds so familiarly the same. To us, they sound like the same thing. And if you don't have a discerning eye and you don't have a timeline and you haven't figured this stuff all out, you could look at that and go, oh, they're talking about the same thing. No, there are two subjects going on here. Just like in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 5, there were two subjects going on. He starts in the first chapter 4, lays out the concept of the rapture. Then he went to chapter 5 and he said there is a contrast going on here. Those who are of the day, they get one coming. Those who are of the dark or the night, they get another coming. And so once he does that in that chapter 5 of 1 Thessalonians, then you come into 2 Thessalonians 2, and you right off the bat see, here's the contrast again. The coming of the Lord for the gathering, and the day of the Lord, it's not yet come. And he's saying that day is not yet come. It's not going to come until that apostasy comes. So then he goes on to begin to say what's going to happen when he does have this appearance of his coming. Because if you drop right down to verse 8 right off the bat, then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will do what? Slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. So let's just make a list about the things that are going to happen by the appearance of his coming. Verse 2. Yes, these are both 2 Thess.
And that is verse 8.
2. This one is verse 8.
Because verse 8 says, and then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume.
Oh, you've got a different translation. Are you using your New American Standard Bible?
Well, it should be pretty much the same. And this is 2 Thessalonians.
Okay, keep going. Keep reading because you're not there yet.
Consume and destroy with the brightness of his coming. Period.
Oh, wow. That's a really different translation. What is your translation? What Bible are you in? That's where you're probably going to, I really advise you work out of a New American Standard or a New English.
This is the New King James.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm surprised they dropped it off totally. Well, that's why you're not getting the correct interpretations. The other thing is if you just use your observation worksheet, use your observation worksheets that you've already done them in our homework. All the homework we've done together, Thessalonians was one of our homework days. And if you use that observation worksheet, this is how mine reads. Listen to what mine says. And follow along in your Bible so you can see where it deviates. Then that lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. Well, you missed by the appearance of his coming. So what is the title of the day of the Lord and the appearance of his coming? Well, by the appearance of his coming, there are going to be a couple things that are going to happen. That's in verse 8. So that's one of the titles that describes the day of the Lord, the appearance of his coming. Are you following me? Okay. So the appearance of his coming, I guess I could just skip that, but the appearance of his coming, what is he going to do? Well, there's a couple of things he's going to accomplish. What does he do in verse 8? Yeah, he's going to slay. If you just cut it down to he's going to slay. He's going to slay the lawless one. Is that the only one he's going to slay? No, there's going to be a lot more slaying going on. But in this text, they just mentioned the lawless one, okay? And also, what is he going to do in verse 12? Because 2 Thessalonians 2 go all the way to verse 12. He's going to judge. He's going to slay and he's going to judge. Now, does that follow what we've looked at in Revelation 19? So you can put Revelation 19 right in there as a cross reference to the fact that at his coming, he's going to both slay and judge. In Revelation, it says he comes for war and to judge, right? Okay, so that's the first part of it. Now let's go back and talk about that man of lawlessness. We know there's going to be a man of lawlessness concerning his appearing. Man of lawlessness. What do we learn about him? When does he show up? Does he show up in this day when does he have to be present for Jesus to be able to slay him when he comes? Yeah, so he's already there. He's already, the man of lawlessness basically has come. It says that he will come. He said that in verse 9. And how does he come? With power, signs, and what else? False wonders. There you go. In verse 9, correct? Okay, with the activity of Satan, you said. So now what we can say is, concerning the day of the Lord, some of the descriptions of that day is there is going to be a man of lawlessness. He's going to come with power, signs, and false wonders. Do you think those are going to be pretty obvious when those things begin to happen? From someone who we know now from our other study that this man of lawlessness is who? Who is he in the book of Revelation? Who is he called? The beast, right? I don't think I call him the Antichrist. We call him the Antichrist, but that is who he is. But he's the beast. So the beast is going to show up at the end time with power, signs, and false wonders. Where do you find that in Revelation? Yep, 13. Very good. In 13, we see all the description about the beast and about the false prophet in chapter 13. So you can go back to Revelation 13. So see, are you seeing kind of what I'm doing is I'm writing things down. I'm going, oh, that's here. Oh, that's here. And all I have to do is give myself a little note. Now, for some of you, that's a real challenge. It's going to be a real challenge. I understand that. But if you will lay out your other charts and lists that you've done so that you have quick access to them, it'll be really, really helpful to you. The other thing is, this is why I always tell you, if you keep your observation worksheets handy, every time you get a reference that is a cross reference, write it in right there on the text. That way you always have it when you go back. Okay. All right. Now, and God is going to do, we've already said he's going to slay at his appearance. What is God going to do? Jesus will slay him, right? So that's going to be a pretty big indicator that you're in the day of the Lord when this happens. In verse 8, and you can go on and write the description with the breath of his mouth, and he's going to bring him to the end by the appearance of his coming. You can give all those details if you want, right? What are some other indicators that you can see that might be tangible enough to be signs about the day of the Lord? What else is going to be going on besides the lawless one being slain? Is that in here? Okay. Okay. Yes, let's put that on there. The man of lawlessness is, let's see, I should do this. So you got little points. He will take his seat. In the temple. Okay, and good. Anybody? What else? Okay, deception of, can you identify the deception of wickedness? I suppose you could identify wicked activity, but we know taking a seat in the temple is going to be obvious, right? There's another thing that's going to be obvious. So what is his yes, he's going to declare himself as God. He opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God, right? And I like the fact that it says so called. That was pretty good. Is that also verse 4? Okay, good. So when you see this thing about him taking his seat in the temple and he opposes and exalts himself above all gods, is there a cross reference that reminds you of? Well, we just did one together, right? In Matthew 24. Was that 4:15, right? What else? Any other? Well, Matthew 24:15 quotes who? Daniel. So we know it also goes back to Daniel 9, right? 24 to 27. Where does it tell us about this idea of him having, oh, we already did that, the false signs and wonders, so that we've already covered that. Sorry. Okay. All right. Are there any other things that you drew out of 2 Thessalonians 2 that would be helpful? We have two titles, the day of the Lord and the appearance of his coming. We see these are the activities that would be visible to identify that day, right? The appearance of his coming, and his is who? Jesus. Right? So the appearance of Jesus is coming. So it's his physical coming, appearance. You can visibly see him. I think that actually does a pretty good job of refuting anyone who says we're right now in the day of the Lord. Right? So if we're in the day of the Lord, where is the appearance of his coming? Yeah, right. True. Why are we still here? That's my question. Right. Okay. All right. So that's 2 Thessalonians. Anything else? We have, let's talk about some synonyms, though, that you should know at this point for the man of lawlessness. Let's just make a list over here for fun, real quick. This man of lawlessness. And I won't ask you for references. I'll put them up here as you holler things out. Tell me what are some other names he has? That's an activity, but what's his name? What is he called? Okay, that will work. I didn't do that one. The one who makes desolate. Although that's not a title most of us spew out of our mouth. We usually go straight to the prince who is to come. Yeah, the prince who is to come. Okay, and that's in Daniel 9. Okay, all right. So prince who is to come is the one I really kind of like better. The other one's a little lengthy. Okay, but it works. Give me any other names for him. The Antichrist, the beast. I like that, beast. Okay, the beast, and that's all in Revelation. I'm just going to write Revelation in general. Where else? What was the other one that someone said? The little horn. Yeah. Little horn, and that's in Daniel 7. Okay, what else? Son of destruction. Okay, that's in 2 Thessalonians.
Father of lies.
That's Satan.
Oh, that's right.
This is the man of lawlessness, but that was a good try. You were trying to trick me, I know. In Daniel 11, he's called something too. Remember that one? What happens in Daniel 11, where it's giving the unfolding of time, and it says, and at the end time, and what comes at the end? Another horn. Huh? The king, that's right. The end time, when it's just referred to as the end time king, right? Good job. End time king. That's in Daniel 11. It actually starts in 36. I'll give it to you so that you know where to start reading on that if you want it. The beast is all throughout Revelation. I'll just put 17:11 on here as one place, but you can look everywhere in there. All right, so that kind of gives you a realm of these names. And this is where, of course, again, when you're working in eschatology, you have to be familiar with all of the synonyms to a person's name. And as what just happened with Susan, you can sometimes make a slip and go, oh, Antichrist, Satan. Well, why do we sometimes make that mistake of slipping back in and identifying him as Satan himself? Yeah, because he comes with the activity of Satan. Everything he does is empowered by Satan. And so it's so easy to see the two as one. Sometimes the other thing that's a problem for us in eschatology is when you're speaking about the end time king, or are you talking about the end time kingdom, both of them are referred to as a beast. And so then you have to split the hairs on that. When is it talking about the beast kingdom? When is it talking about the beast king himself? And you have to determine by the context of what's being said, is it speaking about the nation at the time of the conversation, or is that conversation about the end time king who's going to be thrown into the lake of fire? Then you're talking about an individual, not a kingdom, right? Although the kingdom will be destroyed, it's the king who goes into the eternal fire. Okay, so that's our first one. We have 40 minutes. We shouldn't need to, this one was a good one to start with in that it took the most time. The rest of them should not take us nearly this long. Let's move on now then to day 2 homework, and it was in Acts 2. Let's come up with our titles of what we see there. Okay, good. The great and glorious day of the Lord. I don't like that title, but because I don't know how great and glorious, it might be great, but glorious, I don't know. I guess terrifying would be a better term to me. All right, and we are in Acts 2, correct? Acts 2:20. Okay. All right. Any other titles in there? There is another reference, though, that comes up, another time reference that's mentioned. Did you notice? We start in verse 16, but this is what was spoken of through the prophet Joel. And it shall be what? In the last days. Now, that's interesting. What are the last days? Are the last days the same thing as the day of the Lord? Does anybody know? Okay. I want somebody please to turn to Hebrews 1 and read verse 2. We probably should.
In these last days has spoken to us in his Son, who he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the world.
Okay, so what is it? How does it identify then the last days right there? What is it affixed to? What personage is it affixed to? Jesus. So the last days then begin, because what God says is in former days, he spoke to us through the prophets, right? But now he speaks to us how? Through the Son. And he does that starting when? In the last days. So in these last days, now speaks to us in his Son. So what does that tell you about the last days? When did they begin? At the when Jesus came into the world, right? So we can say right here are the last days, right? And they go on until you begin a new time frame, which is well, right now we just know that there's a new time frame that follows the beginning of this trip. We're not quite sure how far back the day of the Lord is going to go yet, but we can know that the last days for sure begin with the church age, and wherever they end, they're going to end when the day of the Lord begins. It's going to become a new era, right? Not that they're not also part of the last days in my thinking, but technically what God is saying is he's speaking to us through his son in the last days. So that's how we identify that phrase. So he's saying, so the last days is not the days of the Lord. So that is going to clarify, I think, for you what's said that follows it. I will pour forth of my spirit on all mankind. When did that happen? When did God pour forth his spirit on all mankind? At Pentecost, and that birthed the church. So the last days birthed the church. Are you following? So the information right here in this first part of our passage that we were assigned to read concerning the day of the Lord is really about the last days first, correct? And he said first, so the day of Pentecost had come. They were all gathered together in one place. That was in verse 1 of Acts 2. In verse 4, it says, and they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with one another in tongues as the Spirit was giving them utterance. Then starting verse 11, was 11 to 15 assigned to us? I'm looking here. Yeah, no, it wasn't. But okay, so I went back and included some of these other verses for context. You almost have to do it. He talks about they were all speaking the mighty deeds of God. Well, what is it to have the mighty deeds of God's being spoken? Well, in the context of this conversation, it's that they shall prophesy. So they spoke in tongues. When they spoke in tongues, they were speaking the gospel message about Jesus, about his coming. Some faction of the gospel was being preached. And it says here in verse 17, and it shall be in the last days, God says, I will pour forth of my spirit on all mankind, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. So who is the your sons and your daughters speaking of? How should you mark that? The Jews, right? So he's saying your sons and your daughters, because remember, if you go back and you look at this, this is the marking of a new covenant, correct? Because this is the promise of a new covenant. And the part of the new covenant that made it distinct was it was going to be sealed by the Holy Spirit being put within man and God's law written on our hearts by that Spirit. And so here's what we're seeing happening. And he says those things are going to happen in the last days. So they're going to speak the mighty deeds of God. They did when they prophesied. How did they prophesy? When the Spirit filled them, then they began to speak in tongues. So the filling of the Holy Spirit came in the last days, which birthed the church. And men were now speaking the gospel concerning Jesus. In verse 18, he says, even on my bond slaves, both men and women. Now, this is an interesting point too here. What does that do for us concerning the marking of the text? We marked sons and daughters as the Jews, but what does it say? And even on my bond slaves, both men and women. Who would that be? Gentile believers. That's right. So now we have Jew and Gentile in one body, although it's not explained here, it's alluded to, right? And he says, I will in those days, what days? The last days, pour forth of my spirit, and they shall prophesy. Now, verse 19 starts with the word and. So you need to circle that because now you're moving on to the next part of this statement. And I will grant wonders in the sky above, signs on the earth below, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, before the great and glorious day of the Lord shall come. So here is a picture of signs or indicators that we can write down on our descriptive list that show us what we can see. Remember what was asked of Jesus in Matthew 24. What will be the sign of your coming? And he listed all these things that would be signs for them. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for the signs that we can tangibly look for that indicate to us we're approaching the day of the Lord. So let's make a list then on those things that are given to us there. So beginning when Jesus was birthed on. It could. This is what I'm saying. Well, at Alpha, it says at the end. Well, you'd have to show me a verse and we'll talk it out. I know. Yeah. The last days. Well, it says in those last days, it could include, the last days could include more. All I was doing was showing you what we know thus far. I'm trying not to go beyond what we have looked at so far. But if you can pull a verse out, then we can take that blue line and extend it. And I'm happy to do that. I just need a verse. Okay, you can go. That's your job this week. You find another verse that shows the end time and it's affixed to activities that are happening down in here. And then we can pull that line all the way down. Okay. For right now, we know the last days has to do with the birthing of the church and at least goes up into this point. I mean, I'm not saying that it ends there. I'm just saying that we know for sure it goes through the church age at this point. When we add in more cross-referencing, we can determine whether we think the last days actually includes all of this. And if it does, then the last days, but the last days can still not be the part that it looks like so far is going to be the day of the Lord, which seems to be affixed very much with these activities of abomination and war and Jesus's physical coming. So far, that's what we see. It's the appearance of his coming. So we can put right here, 2 Thess 2, appearance of his coming. Right? Are you following me? Okay. All right. So I just don't want to take the liberty of putting that on there without a reference, and I don't have one.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up specifically because if I'm misinterpreting it when I'm reading all this.
I know. Yeah. But one thing you know for sure, what absolutely at this point, what you know for sure is that the last days, according to Hebrews, what was that? Hebrews 1:2, I think it was. The last days began with speaking, begins with the Son, the speaking to man and to humanity through his Son, right? Okay. And how far down that's going to go, I don't know. The thing is you got to remember also the context of each scripture verse, you know, that's being referenced. So that's why I don't want to take the liberty of just putting it all the way to the end of the age without knowing if I have a reference for that, which I don't. Right now, I don't anyway. Okay.
I was thinking like the last that add, your mind is sometimes sweaty because it doesn't give the mean same thing, right? Add and last, you know.
Error?
When you think you the wording for the
And last
the
is-
end.
End and last. Last days and the end. Yeah, see, this is the problem with English. English really, I wish we all just spoke Hebrew and Greek. It would be, yeah, it would be so much easier. But yeah, anytime we're working in class, you know, we just want to validate what we're putting up there for sure. That's why I keep asking you for references whenever we can. We try to plug them in. So I know the last days begin here. How far it goes, I'm not certain at this moment. I just know it began with Jesus's, but we do know that the day of the Lord so far does not come back here.
Right.
We didn't start the day of the Lord back here, but we do have the day of the Lord down there. But we do have the last days here. So they are two distinctive time references. That's my point. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. Also, the coming of the Lord for the brethren. That was another term. The coming of the Lord. And I'm just going to put rapture. And I'm going to put a question mark. But it's another time frame. We just know that it comes before the day of wrath for sure at this point. But other than that, we're not sure. But that one also came out of your Thessalonians. Let me see. Verse 1, 2 Thessalonians 2:1. Okay. So his coming is different than the day of the Lord. All right. Let's make a list. What'd you get out of Acts? Again, in Acts, it's very interesting because it calls it by phrase, the great and glorious, yeah, great and glorious day. Oops, I forgot.
Maybe it's called that because, you know,
Yeah,
maybe that's why.
yeah. Or maybe it's just because it shows God in all his power and glory. And what it does is also it counterbalances what we on this side of the cross always see God as, which is the God of love. And we don't see the counterbalance that you can't have justice without judgment, and you can't have mercy without righteousness. So righteousness and justice are kind of a counterbalance to one another. And on this side, that's all we ever see him as. But the great and glorious day reveals him as the judge and the righteous judge. So maybe that's a little bit what that's about too. Okay, 2:20 is our verse. I forgot to write it down. Okay, so then we're looking at the great and glorious day. Okay, tell me what you know about the great and glorious day from Acts 2. It's another title. Yes, the great and glorious day of the Lord. That's seen in Acts 2:20. Okay, and so I pulled the title down here, and now we need to list the things that we learn out of Acts 2:20 concerning that glorious day. You might want to back up to verse 19, though. There's some good stuff there too.
Well, it says before the great glorious day, there will be wonders in the
Okay.
sky and signs in the earth.
Okay, that's a good point. I'm thankful you said that because I meant to bring that up. Okay, so we'll put a clock on this. Before the great and glorious day of the appearance of his coming, concerning the appearance of his coming, before the appearance, the great and glory of that great and glorious day. Maybe that's what it's about, just his appearing. And we're all going to be so happy he's shown up, which is what we're praying for daily, right? Okay, so the great and glorious day. Now tell me some things that are going to be going on in nature, in our world at that time. Back up to verse 19 if you can. Okay.
Signs on the earth beneath.
Okay, now, so that's kind of general wonders and signs, right? So then you go into the next part of that verse, and it gives a little bit more definition. What does it say there? Blood, fire, vapor, and smoke. Those are going to be some very good indicators that you're in the day of the Lord, right? Okay, or that you're approaching the day of the Lord, because these are the signs of that day of the Lord coming, right? And then it says in 20 about the sun. Those are pretty distinctive things, which is why you all were looking at that blood moon, wondering if this is going to be it. Okay, so all right, one more thing we're going to look at now. Let's move on into 2 Thessalonians or 1 Thessalonians 4 to get our list. We didn't do it while we were there, so we're going to go back and do that. Four and 5. I got those lids switched. Nice. Crazy. Okay, so in there, how is it called? In 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, what are the titles for that day there? Do you have it handy? You looked at 1 Thessalonians. Okay, day of the Lord. Very good. Yep. Day of the Lord. And that was in 5:2. But it also goes on. Go to the next part of it. Keep going. I think it should. Oh, no, it isn't there. It's in verse 9. I'm sorry. Because she told us to read the fuller range, and then she gave us one verse where the statement of the day of the Lord is given. But she says, now go back and read all of this. So she really wanted you to cover the whole segment, not just the one verse. Some of you may have gotten confused on that and really skated by on your homework. What else is it? In verse 9, there's another title for this. It's referred to wrath. It's God's wrath. It's not quite as clear of a title, but I do think it's distinctive enough for us. We should pick up on that because we know we're looking at wrath. We know we're in the bowls of wrath at this point when the abomination of desolation occurs. And we already know from the outline in Matthew that we're in that day of the Lord starting there. So we're good to go. We can say, okay, so God's wrath could be another title. Anytime you see the wrath of God, read the full context. Is it speaking of in that day? And if it is, then you know you can put that information down there. Okay, so the contrast there is, but you, brethren, are not destined for that day of wrath, right? In verse 9 also, brethren are not destined for wrath, but for salvation. Okay, so now what did you see in chapter 5? Let's look at 5 first. It comes like a thief in the night. That's not very clear for identifying it, although it might be after the fact. So you could write that on there because it probably comes up repeatedly, possibly. Yes. We're not of that day. The day of the Lord is not for you and I. It's for those who have not received the love of the truth, right? Brethren are going to be meeting him in the Lord, and he's going to descend from heaven, and we will be caught up in the clouds to meet him. That does not sound like that day of wrath to me at all. That's a totally different scenario, isn't it? So that's where you can see there is a contrast going on in that book. That's why I said, if it were me, I would mark in my Bible contrast the day of the Lord and the coming of the Lord, and then say the coming of the Lord equals rapture, day of the Lord equals wrath. And then you have wrath and rapture, and you see that there's a contrast going on in those two statements, and then you can follow that flow of thought much better once you identify that. Okay. All right, so now it comes like a thief. 5:2. What else? How about in 3? Yeah, it will come suddenly. Maybe that's why the thief concept is in there. Okay, and that's in 5:3 of 1 Thessalonians. Were there any other really distinctive things in there that you want to list? I mean, there were other things said but they're kind of more like your sons of night, the sons of night will not escape it. I don't know if that's a good indicator. I don't know if that's very clear to see by the naked eye, just looking at it. God's wrath is destined for those who do not obtain salvation through Jesus. But where is the wrath of God falling? Again, it's in the 7 bowls, right? That's in Revelation 16. Okay. All right, let's move on. Do you have anything else to say? You're awful quiet. Okay, let's go to Peter.
Those verses always confuse me where it says that people are saying peace and safety and they're surprised and it's shocking.
Oh,
It doesn't sound like.
no, it doesn't sound like this at all. But do you know what it does sound like? It sounds like the first seal, doesn't it? When he comes on that white horse and he's through diplomacy and he's making a covenant with them. So now what have you just done? You've now brought the day of the Lord possibly all the way back to that first seal. Good job. You can take a bow. That was a very good catch. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, now 2 Peter 3, and we're looking at 1 to 13, and we're looking to see how is it identified in that particular one. Okay, we got the day of the Lord in verse 10. Okay, okay, let me put that on. Day of the Lord. Day of the Lord. And that's in 3:10, you said? Okay. Are there any other ways that it's referred to? Follow all the way down to 12. Just keep moving along. There you go. Okay, the coming day of God. In verse 12. And also in verse 4, there's another one. If you missed it, I don't know how many of these, you kind of have to be reading with the purposed intention of saying, how else might the day of the Lord be phrased in the flow of this conversation? Because the conversation's already been identified as that they're speaking of the day of the Lord by naming it the day of the Lord. That's how Kay took us. So what she's actually doing for us right now, we're actually doing, again, another topical study. And we are going into pretty much all the references that we can squeeze in these 2 weeks to look to see where we literally see that phrase, day of the Lord, and we're looking to try to identify it by its qualifiers, looking for people, places, events, any kind of physical manifestation that would be a clue that we could say, oh, we are in the day of the Lord. That is what the day of the Lord will look like, right? We are not going to be there to see it. We now just have now discerned that we are not destined for that day of wrath. But we can now know that the day of the Lord is also called a day of wrath, but it's also called a day when they say peace and safety, right? So in a way, let's see, that one was in, what reference did you see that peace and safety one? And we should put that up here. This one? Let's say peace and safety. I remember reading it. I know exactly what you're talking about. I just don't know the reference. I don't have it on mine. I didn't put it as a title, but in a way I like it because it's also going to help expand verse 5:3. Okay. Okay. So it's going to be a day of peace and safety. And although that's not necessarily a title like the day of the Lord, it's definitely a good way to have identified it. Let's see, First Thess 5:3. First Thess 5:3. Peace and safety. Cool. Okay. We're not going to get through it all. That's the way it is. Okay. Second, does that surprise us? 2 Peter. Kay just gives us too much. How about verse 4? There's a really good one there. Somebody read verse 4 in 2 Peter 3.
Saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fellowship both extended just as it was from the beginning.
Okay, so it's also his what? His coming, or the promise of his coming, right? So let's put that up here, the promise of his coming. Are you seeing how I'm doing this? Because you're going to be doing this yet again next week. So you're just getting the swing of things. You want to kind of keep this pattern up. 4. Okay, let's see if we can get some qualifiers up here real quickly. You guys have to be fast or we're not going to get through hardly anything here. Okay. Heavens will pass away with a roar. Verse 10. So now where are we on the timeline? Wow. Heavens will pass away with a roar. So heavens pass away. And that is, give me that reference again. 2 Peter 3, what? 2 Peter 3:10. So now we have the day of the Lord. Let's go up here. Day of the Lord seems like it starts right here at the beginning of the trib. And so far, it takes us all the way down here. Are you noticing? Because we just added in the day when we get a new heaven and a new earth. So the day of the Lord is going to begin, or at least the qualifiers of it, the things that you can identify the day of the coming of him. It's going to include the appearance of his coming, but it also seems like it includes some of the time things that happened before his coming, because it's in the same way that in Matthew 24, Jesus says, these are going to be the signs of the coming. And they're specific and distinct enough that that's a time reference that's going to be unique on the earth that day. Physically, his coming is his appearing, is the day of the Lord. That's what they are looking for. But it sure seems to me those first 7 years that precede it are those signs that Jesus spoke of in Matthew 24 that give the lead up to it. So a lot of times then when you're looking at information that's given about this day of the Lord, in the references that are coming up next, you're going to see activities that can fall again back in those first 3.5 years. All right. Let's see what else. So we see heavens are going to pass away, and it's going to go on and on and on. The elements melt. Earth is burned up. Okay, and that's in verse 10. We are looking for new heavens and new earth, right? Or we are looking for them. I should have put that at the beginning of the sentence. Okay, verse 7 tells us also about this, though. It's also called what? What does verse 7 say?
The present heavens and earth by his word are being preserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment.
The day of judgment. A day of judgment. Of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. So we just backed up, didn't we?
Yeah.
So now we've got this one up here is the new heaven and the new earth, but now we backed into the judgment time frame. Destruction of ungodly men. Now, this destruction of ungodly men, the day of judgment and then the destruction of ungodly men, is that only going on in these last 3.5 years? No, do you remember when they're crying out beneath the rocks? Right? And then they say, how can anyone stand? Right? In chapter 6.
We're also going to have it at the very, very end of 1,000 year reign too, when everybody surrounding the city, God goes, "Boom."
That's true. I hadn't thought of that one. Good point. although it's not going to be quite the same, because it's not going to be like a battle. It's not going to be, it is a judgment, but it comes on them suddenly. It's not destruction of and judgment. So you're right. I guess it could be either. Yeah, could be beginning or end. So this one can go at the very beginning over here, or it could go all the way at the end of the 1,000-year reign, just before you enter into the new heavens and the new earth. It's right here you have Gog and Magog. I'm going to call it a war, but it's not really a war. It's a suddenness. Was that in chapter 20? I think 20, Revelation 20, something, the end of it. Okay. All right. So that's great. Destruction of ungodly men. And that's in verse 7. Okay. Now we can move on. Let's go to the next one. We get to move to Old Testament. Let's go to Joel. And how does Joel refer to this day?
Great and very awesome. You can endure it.
It's great and awesome. A day of destruction. From the Almighty. That was a really good definition, isn't it? Day of destruction from the Almighty. And that one is verse what? Okay. Okay, so these are in Joel. And we're in chapter 1 and 2 right now. Okay. Okay, let's see what we can come up with then on a board. So we're in Joel and 2, and it's called the Day of the Lord. By title in Ligwe. And what verse was that one in? Does anybody have that? 15, 115. All right. Okay. Now let's just do a list of other things that we learn about the day of the Lord from there. What is God going to be doing in that day? Yeah, he's okay. A day of darkness and gloom. ER is going to be there. What is the reference? Darkness and gloom is what verse? Chapter 1, verse 2? 2:2. Okay, thank you. All right, any others?
2:30 is displaying wonders in the sky.
Yeah. Wonders again in sky and earth in 2:30. Also again, sun darkened. Moon to blood. And that's in 2:31. Did you notice in this one again in verse 32, he concludes by saying, but whoever calls on the name of the Lord, he will be delivered. There will be those who will escape. There will be survivors whom the Lord calls. That's really cool. I like that. Although I don't think that's a good indicator of it coming. I'm just saying. I thought it was a good input. Indeed, great and awesome. Okay. All right. So let's move to the next one. Joel 3. Okay. 2 minutes. Joel 3. Day of the Lord is near. That again, just called the day of the Lord. I didn't see any other specific titles. I did see some very good geographical markers given to us in here. It talks about judgment taking place, right? He's going to gather the nations. They're going to come up to where? So he will gather the nations to the valley of what? Valley of Jehoshaphat. 𝐽𝐬𝐻𝐽𝐬𝐸𝐻𝐴𝐻𝐴𝐵𝐻. Gosh, could that possibly be wrong? Yes. 𝐻𝐴𝐵𝐻. I guess I did have it right. It just didn't look right. Okay, whatever. It's good. We know, right? Jehoshaphat. Okay. And that's in verse 12, called the valley. Now it's restated in verse 14. So another name, so that you know the valley of Jehoshaphat is also called what? Valley of Decision. Wonder what kind of decision it is. Choose this day whom you shall serve. Kind of made me think of that. Yes. Did you notice in verse 14, it just restates it in that flow of conversation? He doesn't leave that conversation. He just calls it by a different title. And in that place in verse 13, what is going to happen there? The wine press will be tread there. Wine press, tread. And that's in verse 13. Now, where do we know the wine press gets tread here? Yes. Who treads it? Because his cloak is dipped in blood. Which bowl are we in? Seventh bowl. So here we're now right here again at the end at the seventh bowl. This is going to be the wine press. The treading of wine press. And that's where are we again? Joel. Yeah, we're Joel 3:13. And you can line that up with your Revelation references. Revelation 14, 19, and 20 is another one, because here, look else what it says in 13, besides the winepress being tread. What else does it say? It's going to happen. Tells them to do something. Yeah, put in the sickle. What is this? What's going on there? What kind of harvest are we getting? Well, the harvest, but what are they harvesting and what does it relate to in Revelation? The harvest is ripe. Think about it. We're in.
The angel tells Jesus the harvest is ripe.
Yes. So Jesus is harvesting, and then who follows Jesus? The angels harvest. And when they harvest, what do? They throw them into the great wrath of God the Almighty. Yes. So that goes back to Revelation 14. If you want to go back and look at that, the harvest is ripe. That's in verse 13. Okay. So now we've got Revelation 14. We can add that on here. Okay. Joel 3. Now we have Obadiah. And we did 1 through 15. And what is it called there? Come on, y'all. It should be on your list. Day of the Lord. So easy. I'm not tricking you. Okay. Tell me what you learned about the day of the Lord there. Yeah. What did he do with the nations? Okay. So it's judgment of the nations then. Yeah. Judgment of nations by the Lord. I'm paraphrasing on that one quite a bit, but we see that where it says in verse 115, as Edom has done, it will be done to her. And in 16, all the nations will become as if they had never existed, right? Okay, and then in 17, what happens at Mount Zion? In Obadiah 1:17. Oh, yeah. Okay, does it not say on Mount Zion there will be those who escape? Yeah. Now, what does that sound like? Yeah. So on Mount Zion, exactly. On Mount Zion, there will be those who escape. And that's in verse 17. We didn't quite go that far, but I pulled it in because it was very distinctive. Mount Zion will be holy. When does that happen? It has to be here, right? Once all the judging is done, and he says everything in his area, in his holy city, will be holy unto the Lord, and the stranger will not pass through. What does that mean? The stranger. No unbeliever. Well, there's another place that says that no Canaanite will be there, right? So speaking about that, there won't be unbelievers in there. And then in verse 21, I want you to read that one, somebody, because it's not on your list, I know, but I added it, and you'll see why.
Deliverers will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom.
The kingdom will be the Lord's. So that's in verse 21. Okay, that's good for Obadiah. Let's move on now to Amos 5. I'm going to give you a general statement. In Amos 5, we were to look at two verses, 18 and 20, because those are the two places where it said they were longing for the day of the Lord, right? And then he asks them back, for what purpose are you longing for that day? You who are. And so I backed up and I read verse 7, and what we see here is Israel's sin is being brought God's judgment. So God is judging Israel for her sin at this point. He's calling her on the carpet on all the things that she's been doing. So 1 through, let's put on here, Israel's sin judged by God. Is that going to happen at the end days? Is it only applying to back in the day when Amos was receiving this? Did God judge Israel in ancient days? Yes, they went into Syrian captivity, they went to Babylonian captivity, right? But in that day, will there also be a day where God is judging Israel for her sins? Is that not what the whole 7 years is about? Is about God bringing Israel back into relationship with him. So verses 1 through 7 shows you a foreshadow of what's going to happen at the end of the age. And then he says in verses 4, 6, and 14, yet God persisted in calling Israel back. He kept saying, but come to me, seek me, right? I'm compassionate, I'm full of grace. I will forgive you if you'll just turn. In this time, as God threatens judgment, he calls them back to him. So that's going to happen also at the end of the time, right? We can see this. This is verse 4, verse 6, and verse 14 of Amos 5. Otherwise, why do you long for the day of the Lord? It's going to be of what? Day of darkness. What else? No light. Not light. Contrasts here.
Yeah.
Right? 18. And in 20, what else? Gloom. Again, with no brightness. Contrast. Okay, and that's in verse 20. Okay, so basically we're starting to see repetition here, right? We have one more to do. If you guys will hang in there with me, I'll get this one last one, and that's Isaiah 13. It's verse 6 and 9, where the verses you were handed. There's really only one new title to add over here that I can see besides the day of the Lord, which it says very clearly in verse 6, right? But do you see it in verse 13? Yeah, in 6, yeah, that's when it's clear. But what about 13? Yeah, it's the day of his burning anger. And that's in verse 13. Okay, so now let's see, what else do we see then? It comes how? To make the land a desolation. Okay. And give me that verse. In verse 9, okay. It comes as destruction from the Almighty again. Almost word for word from what he said in the other one. Where was that again? The Almighty. We saw it over here because I wrote it here. Joel 1 and 2 and Isaiah are almost the same, huh? Okay. Any new insights in there? I like verse 11. You have to go just beyond those verses she gave. Look at verse 11. Yeah, he's going to punish the world for.
I will also put it into the arrogance of the proud.
And okay, God will punish the wicked. Their iniquity, in other words, for sin. No, there's not. But actually, there you go. Mortal men will become scarce. Mortal men will become scarce. At the beginning, basically, you know what this is, guys? This is very similar to the days of Noah, where God came, he saved a few, and he wiped everyone else out. Now, he's going to leave us more than that this time, but it's very similar. If it's going to be a time when mortal men are going to become scarce, so that because the ones that are going to be coming back who are maybe not going to be scarce are going to be those who are in their glorified body at the beginning. Now, as the time passes, those 1,000 years pass, there are going to be a lot more men that then it won't be so scarce. But then guess what happens to most of them? Yeah, God, and they all get zapped in a nanosecond, right? Okay, so mortal man will be scarcer than pure gold in verse 12. The wicked are going to be judged in verse 11. The world, God is going to punish the world for its evil. Again, in 9 and 10, no light. The sun will be darkened. The moon, there's going to be no light. He says in 9, it's cruel with fury and burning anger to make a desolation. Whew. Okay, we did it. I'm over by about 5 minutes. That's not bad for me, guys. I'm still okay with that. Thank you. Let me know if you have questions.